Okay, good morning everybody and welcome again to our People Advisory webinar series. Today I'm really excited to be talking to you about how you build a talent plan using the 6 Bs. Now, it was interesting, I was talking to somebody early today and they said, didn't you do something on the 5 Ps another week ago? So there's lots of acronyms that we use in People Advisory, but the 6 Bs are something grounded in a huge amount of research, and I was actually trying to uncover the exact core of the research. I'm not going to claim it was me, but there's been so much work done on the 6 Bs in the last 5 or more years that it's become part of the vernacular, I think, of really good talent management. So today we're going to take you through that. What I want to first do is introduce you to our People Advisory team here at BDO. For those of you who've been joining our webinars for the last 6 months, you'll have heard from all of us at different periods of time. Today, it's myself, Janine Waters, presenting to you, and I am joined by Callie Mitchell, who is a consultant in our team and looks after our virtual HR solution. So welcome, Callie.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Marianne and Vanessa can't join us today, but if you ever want to hear from them, you can go back and review some of our past webinars and listen to their spirited discussions in those webinars. Just a few housekeeping tips for today. During the webinar, you can access the presentation slides in the handouts pane as shown in the example to the right. Any questions that you submit will be responded via email after the session concludes, but you are also very welcome to contact us directly rather than via the links here. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, visit that link below, support.logmeininc.com, go to webinar. After the webinar, you'll be sent a follow-up email which contains the presentation slides, a link to the recorded session, access to past and future webinars, and all of our contact details. So we'll be very happy to hear from you if you have any specific questions. So today is really focused around talent planning. It's one of my favorite aspects of HR because I see it as so incredibly beneficial to an organization's performance and their future success. And it's where I think we get the most traction and where we as HR professionals add the most value to an organization. So getting this right is critical. It's really about the ability to effectively hire, retain, deploy and engage talent at all levels. And it's the only true competitive advantage, I believe, an organisation possesses. We often talk about, your products can be copied, your infrastructure can be duplicated, but your people are critical to the success of the organisation, and the people that you have and the teams that you create are unique to your organisation. So making sure that you're getting the right people at the right time in the right jobs is critical to your success as an organisation. There was research conducted in 2008 by DDI and the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they found that 55% of executive level respondents said their firm's performance was likely or very likely to suffer in the near future due to insufficient leadership talent. And we see that all the time, don't we, Callie?
Definitely.
In our clients. In past and present organisations that I've worked at, even in BDO ourselves, I know getting the right talent is critical to our success.
Definitely. And I definitely think also too, as part of this talent management and the thinking that needs to occur isn't just for our larger organisations, it's for some of our smaller organisations as well. And even if we look at within our team and the building the HR capabilities within our People Advisory team, we look at these exact same 6 Bs. So we can take it from a really small perspective of those smaller companies' ideas to even some of those larger organisations as well.
You're so right. And when I think about some of our smaller organisations that we work with, it's actually even more critical.
Definitely.
Because every single person is so important. You don't have any flex. You don't have any fat in the organisation to have extra people floating around. So making sure every single role is thought about is really critically important.
Especially as you want to go and move towards the future and really grow that business, you really need to think that through, that future focus.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about the 6 Bs. They're really part of a bigger talent picture. And if you go back 2 webinars ago in April, we focused on the succession planning process and really doing a high value succession planning process for your organisation is a critical starting point. So I would encourage you, if you work for an organisation that's a little immature in their processes around this, or it's a very tick the box exercise and you're not really getting value out of it, please go back and listen to that webinar because it's a really good starting point for this process. We identified then that succession planning in its simplest terms is the identification of talent that can replace your critical roles. And like I said, it's part of that bigger talent picture. When organisations become effective at building their succession plans, they start to see a real picture of where are we now and what are the skills and capabilities we have, where do we need to be, what are the gaps and how will we close them? And the 6 Bs are an essential way of helping us figure out the best way to close those gaps. So you start with your succession planning process and you get really clear about those critical roles and you can start to see a picture of who do you have there. And that's that present view that is really important. So, you know, I still remember a quote one of my old bosses said to me, and I was asking him for directions to Canberra of all places, and he said to me, well, I wouldn't start from here. and I often think about that, and I think about it in the case of business. We are where we are,
yeah,
and the most important thing is understanding where that is.
Definitely.
So getting a clear picture of where you are right now is critical, and what I would recommend that you do is conduct a SWOT analysis. So you've done your succession plan, you've understood what your current talent mix is. Do a SWOT analysis that really helps you understand your talent strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. If you haven't done a SWOT analysis before, Google it. There are a gazillion different templates that you can use and instructions, and I'm sure if you Googled a SWOT for talent, you would get some really specific advice there, but it's a really good starting point for you.
And I think by doing that SWOT analysis, it sort of breaks down, because I think we're talking at very high level and you might be sitting there thinking, okay, what do I need to do? Quick, I better write this down and I am not really sure where the direction we need to go. By doing the SWOT analysis and doing your initial succession planning is just breaking down this step by step by step.
Yeah.
So it's really clear and basic about where your organisation needs to go.
Yeah. I love that. And what I would also say to you is this is not something you do in isolation in the back room of HR. This is where you're partnering side by side with your leaders. Okay, so you're doing this SWOT analysis together. They're inputting into this and you're coming up with a really clear picture of where you are currently. Then it's all about understanding the future. So for me, this is really around what's the future of your organisation? What is the strategy that you're undertaking? Hopefully there is a clear strategy that you've been a part of developing, and that's a 3 or more year horizon. I do notice that organisations, because the world is changing so quickly, our competitors are disrupting, all of those sorts of things, I'm finding for some of our organisations 12 months is as long as their strategy can go, and in fact I have one organisation where even 3 months is a challenge because things are changing so quickly. So whatever that future looks like for you and however far into the future you're planning as an organisation, you need to get really clear on that. You need to be clear also around the context of your metrics as you start to look at it, because when I think about talent, it's one thing to understand where are we going as an organisation, what are the capabilities we're going to need to have in the future, and then also start to think about what do my metrics look like and how does that sort of come into play with some of my thinking. So I'll give you some examples that might kind of bring this to life. In one organisation I worked with, there were some really clear disruptors that were happening in the market. So we'd gone from a very traditional marketing type scenario, which was really more account management than marketing. And we could see that coming down the pipeline were more and more opportunities to engage directly with our customers and consumers and to start to build awareness of our products and to start to tap into the fact that people are making decisions around that on an individual and personal basis. So we could see that there was going to be a need for different marketing skill sets and capabilities to help us capitalize on where we wanted to be in the future. At the same time, time, we looked at our metrics and we could see that we were really struggling from a diversity perspective. We were really struggling to get females seated around the table. And, you know, the traditional ways we had been recruiting people up and through, we were seeing lots of women coming through and then sort of stopping at the manager role and not being able to progress them above that. Another thing we were seeing was that when we brought people in at senior leadership levels, we were struggling with them fitting into the culture.
Mm-hmm.
So we were seeing higher rates of turnover when we brought people in at a senior role, and we were really struggling to get the recruitment right there. So there were a whole lot of dynamics that we started to see as we really sat down and analysed our future needs, where those gaps were. We could see that we had, you know, in some instances, one person across 6 critical roles as the successor, and we could see that there were some significant gaps in our succession planning. So what we did as we started to work through our planning was to think about it in the context of the 6 Bs. And what we'll do in a minute is kind of go through that and give you an idea of how they relate. But then what you're really focusing on is thinking about what's the gap.
Yep.
So understand where you're at, understand where you want to get to, and then this is all about thinking about, well, what's the gap that you need to bridge, and what are the skill sets that you're going to need to bring on and the types of people that you're going to need to bring on or build to close that gap. So that gets us to the all-important 6 Bs. What are they, you are wondering? Okay, so the 6 Bs of talent management are build, buy, borrow, bind, boost, and bounce. I'm going to take you through them really briefly here, and then we're going to go through each one of them and think about what are some of the questions you should be asking yourself to decide whether this is the strategy you should be taking, and what are some examples of what this might look like in your organisation. So build is exactly as it sounds. It's all about developing your internal talent. It's usually around a longer term plan, and you'll be thinking around some of those roles that you bring people in and you develop them up through the organisation to get to some of your senior leadership roles for in the future. Buy is around acquiring required external talent. So that's your recruit. That's where you sit down and say, right, this is either something we can't or don't want to or don't have time to build, and we're going to go externally and buy that talent in. Borrow is around, we might not need that skill set for the longer term. So we're going to think about, or it might be a very specific skill set that we're finding hard to find. There could be a myriad of reasons, but we're going to borrow that skill set in and we're going to use it for the short term as part of our broader strategy. Binding, that's the retention of key employees, and we're thinking about that in terms of what are those capabilities that are critical for us to retain and how we're making sure we're keeping the employees that we've previously built or bought into the organisation, and making sure that we bind them to our organisation for the longer term. That's all about retention. Boost is around accelerated planned promotion. So how are we pushing people up through? And that can sometimes be a combined strategy. So you might specifically looking at a boost strategy as part of your bind strategy. How do we keep somebody here? Because we know that our competitors might tap them on the shoulder any minute and try to get them out. And if they're very career driven, we might be wanting to boost them. And finally, bouncing is around removing employees, whether that's because of performance management or redundancy, whether it's because there's a block within the organisation. It's about bouncing out the talent that you no longer need. There was a really great book that I read a while ago by the woman who led the people and culture team in Netflix, Patty McCord, and the book is called Powerful. But she has a great quote that I refer to all the time, and she says, you know, we hire very capable adults for a need that we have in the organisation, and then we have the tough conversations when we get to a point where we say your skills are no longer what we need, and we move that relationship on. So having those powerful conversations can be an important part of your bounce strategy. So now what we're going to do is go through some more detailed examples around these areas. So buy is a fishing expedition, I guess. You're going out there and you're looking at how do you land the right fish into your boat. And I promise I won't do too many ridiculous analogies as we go through. But since my husband is just about to go on a 10-day fishing trip, this seemed very pertinent. So what roles from a succession planning perspective do we not have obvious successors for, and how will we address this? Now, again, you're not always going to think about these any one of these strategies in isolation. This might be a buy strategy where we're saying we're going to buy at a more junior level to quickly boost and build into a future role, or it might be that we're buying directly into a senior position. So we might be thinking here about, it might be an existing vacancy, but we might actually be thinking about, are we going to add some headcount into our business because we see a critical need, and we think we're going to buy somebody into this role to make sure that when we have the vacancy, we're ready to position them into a role. So that can be a really powerful strategy that people do. We might be looking at proactive recruitment for positions that we know the market has a scarcity of talent. So we might start to think about, well, we're going to proactively go out there and look to buy talent now, even though we're not ready for them quite yet. We'll bring them on board and we'll wear that additional cost because we know the cost of not having them is going to be huge. We might be starting to think about things like, do we have any other issues going on in our organisation that we need to think about in terms of our bias strategy and approach? So quick quits, where we have a person come in and leave really quickly in an organisation, high turnover, areas where people aren't making it through their probationary period, or where we're seeing those cultural issues at play. So from the organisation that I was talking about before, what we found was we had some senior roles where it was a really strong culture as an organisation. It was very values driven. And what we found is where we brought people in at a senior level for some of these leadership positions, it was a real struggle to get the right sort of cultural alignment. And we had to think about buying that talent at a slightly more junior level and really quickly developing them up to make sure that we could fill our succession plan appropriately. So as I said, a lot of the time it's not thinking about any one of these in isolation. It's thinking about how we need to combine them. And you might also be thinking from a buy perspective around, do we have approaches to attracting talent from our competitors? Is that something that we particularly want to go out and target? If so, what are those people going to be looking for? What might attract them to us, and how are we going to bring that to fruition?
As part of that buy too, I think we really need to be thinking about how are we bringing that external market in and that external talent in? Are there some of those platforms that we've previously used in the past not been effective?
I love that. And
how can we actually look at different opportunities to actually buy that talent in? So whether it's using different social media platforms, networking, graduate programs, whatever it might be, having a look at, well, how do we currently bring talent to the organisation, and how might we need to do it differently?
I love that. And again, when you're in a larger organisation, you might have a talent acquisition group and really tapping into their experience and working really closely with them as a business partner to think about, well, here's our future direction. This is where we're going. You as a talent acquisition expert, what do you think? When you don't have that expertise in the organisation, you can still do that same work, whether you're in a standalone HR role or whether you're a leader doing this within your business, still taking that time to sit back and go, okay, what's worked for us? What hasn't worked for us? Where are we getting our best talent? Now, again, in that same organisation, what we continually found was that the best alignment we got was when our employees referred talent in.
Definitely.
They knew what our culture was like. They knew what it was like to work there. They knew the people that would fit.
Yeah.
And that was always a much higher rate of conversion to a hire. And then for people that would stay, and our tenured employees tended to be referred.
Definitely. And some of that too is taking that risk to actually think differently and think outside the square. So what you might traditionally have looked at for people for their different skill set and experiences, you might think, okay, well, those skills can actually be transferable and we can actually build on their experience in other organisations, different industries and different roles, and then bring it into the organisation that way.
A really good point. And there's an example from, you know, as we were talking about that marketing skill set that we wanted to bring in, and we really wanted a more commercial, consumer focused marketing, but we had a very traditional account management style approach. I remember we brought someone from a completely different industry. They were actually, we were looking in the medical industry, and we hired someone from building.
Yes.
And I remember the pushback at the senior leadership level at that time going, you know, it doesn't apply, they're not going to be able to get it. But what we had to do was think about what are the capabilities that we're looking for and how are they transferable. And in actual fact, it was one of the best hires that that the organisation made in that time.
Definitely.
So thinking differently around that, I think, is really, really critical. There was something else that came to mind, but it's just slipped back. Oh, look, another client that we've been working with recently, and they've been looking to hire a role, and they've been going through their normal traditional path of what they recruit for. And we identified with them they have really high turnover. They have turnover in roles that where people aren't making their probationary period. And when we looked at their culture and then and understood what it's like to work there, and then looked at the way they were expressing it in their ads, we saw a real disconnect.
Definitely.
What's really interesting, having spoken to them in the last 24 hours when they've put a new ad up that we've helped them redesign, they're saying they're getting really different people applying. So sometimes it's just thinking through, you know, we often just throw out the same hooks, going back to my analogy, that we've done, try, you know, over and over again. And sometimes it's thinking about, well, actually, is the bait that we have on those hooks the ones that really is going to apply?
Yeah, definitely.
For the people that we're trying to attract now.
Yeah.
And I promise no more fishing.
And definitely thinking about that experience of when they first come into the organisation. If you're going to go to all of this effort to bring in this external capability, thinking about that probationary period and thinking what their experiences is going to be, and possibly having to therefore change your approach, change your strategies for those 3 to 6 months to make sure that that employee is going to be there for the long run.
I love that. Yeah, your onboarding strategy around there is critical. Right. So then we start to think about how we build talent in the organisation. And this is really around what few things should we invest and focus on that will make a significant difference to our business. And I've somehow moved all my slides around here, so let me find my notes. Right, so what's the right mix of build versus buy? And we talked a little bit about that previously, where we said, look, we might actually buy talent in at a slightly more junior level with the idea that we're going to build them into the roles that we need from a succession planning perspective. There may be some capabilities and competencies that we really need to develop. You might find that it doesn't actually exist in the market, that you're trying to develop a skill set here that if you're at the cutting edge of a new way of doing business, that skill set might not even exist. Or like we talked about earlier, you might be bringing some capability in from a buyer perspective. So when we brought in that different marketing thinking and using that person to build that capability more broadly in your organisation and helping them influence the development of your other employees. We might be also thinking about when you talk about build, what becomes really critical is making sure that your hiring managers or your leaders are really capable of recognising the difference between hiring for the current role and hiring for the role that they're wanting this person ultimately to succeed into the future. So that's really around, yes, you need to know the skill sets and capabilities and transferable skills that'll be right for now, but it's also around, well, how do we think about potential? How do we assess somebody as someone who's ultimately, we bring them in at this more junior level, is going to be capable of building to a future leader? And if you've listened to our webinars in the past, you'll have hopefully heard the one that we did around learning agility and why some people succeed faster than others or progress faster than others. That was back in February. So if you're trying to think about how do we understand what potential looks like when we're recruiting at one level with the aim of getting them to another, that could be a really good starting point for you. And then it's around how do we really understand the pipeline. So often, again, in succession planning, we really focus on that first line of, you know, where do we have ready now candidates for a role, but looking more deeply into your organisation and understanding what your deeper pipeline looks like is a critical part of thinking about how are you actually, what's your focus need to be from a build perspective, what are the gaps that you're trying to close, and how are you going to develop the right sort of development programs to help close those gaps and bring people along on that development pathway.
And so this build part is all about then having the really right performance management tools in place for your organisation as well, by setting your key objectives, having those discussions with the employees about where they want to go to, what their areas of interest are, and how you can really help build them. So it's coming back, I guess, to some of those basic sort of HR performance management, key objective setting, and with therefore their long-term approach of being able to achieve those objectives.
Yeah, and very much being clear about, again, we did some work with you a couple of months ago, actually only last month we did the career paths and how to build effective career paths. And I think more and more as talent professionals, we need to be thinking about how do we engage people on a career path that's meaningful for them, and how do we think about our career paths in terms of making them meaningful for the organisation and ensuring we're building the talent that we need for the future.
Definitely.
That might be thinking, you know, really differently to how your current, possibly very linear career paths may look. So I would definitely encourage you to go back and look at our career paths webinar. If you're thinking on a build perspective, you need to ramp up the way you do things. Borrow. So borrowing is around where should we outsource our talent or capabilities? Can consultants help us? Is this an area that we are going to be able to do our best in, or is this an area that we really need to tap into? And some of the things you want to think about here is, first of all, what's the nature of the work in terms of the longevity? So again, looking at that organisation that we're helping at the moment, and you know that they went out and started recruiting and using some different ad language, etc. The other thing we talk to them about is that capability that they need for the next 12 months is very different to the capability they need longer term. So what they'll do in that instance is they'll bring a fixed term contract in. They're looking for a skill set that's going to really be very strategic and help build the plans for that department for the next 12 months. But they know that once that work is done, it's going to be very much an implementing style role, a smaller role, and that same person's probably not going to be the right fit. So they've gone in with a very clear strategy around we're going to borrow, we're going to pay for that resource for the next 12 months, and we're going to hire at a higher capability level than we know we need for the longer term. And we're going to be very clear about that with the candidate. And then at the end of that time, we're going to have them help us bring in the right capability for the longer term. So that's a really good example of that. Obviously, consulting can really help in this space as well. Like, we do a lot of work with HR teams who are sitting there saying, right, we really need to think about how we're going to get to where we want to be in the future. We get bogged down in the day-to-day delivery work, and we don't either have the capacity or it's not our strength to really think about that future direction that HR needs to take. So you might bring in a skill set for a period of time to help with that, positioning that, building that, and then help bring the team along. And that can be an important part of the borrow strategy as well. It's not necessarily to come in for whatever way you've set it up, do a piece of work and leave. What you might find is that you're borrowing a capability in to then help build the capability that you have internally. So you might say, great, we're going to do a 12-month project, we're going to borrow that capability in. And while that person is here or those people are here, they're going to help build the longer term capability within the rest of our organisation. So that can be a really powerful strategy to think about.
And it might also too, to that point, Janine, about that borrowing that capability, it might be as you're going through all of this, unsure as to whether or not that's the particular skill set that you actually require for your business because that's the direction that they're going in. So you might just want to borrow it for, I guess, 12-month period, put them on like a contract basis, and then see actually how it unfolds. If it works, fantastic, bring them into the organisation and then build them and move them through some of those other Bs. Or if not, you can actually go, okay, it's the end of the contract, move on, let's look at other opportunities, how we can actually bring this particular capability in.
It's a really good point, because you know, exactly as we've been talking about, things shift and change really quickly. So when you've got an organisation that's saying we're going to test and try this and this, what you don't necessarily want is a whole lot of headcount that you've brought in for the longer term that's not necessarily going to be needed once you've decided which strategy is the one that's going to work for you, or you've tested the market, etc. So borrow can definitely be a really powerful strategy when you're thinking about testing and trying some new ways of operating. So then we start to look at who do we need to bind to our organisation? So you'll see my very symbiotic relationship. I am back on the fish theme. I do apologise for that. Obviously, it was on my mind when I put these slides together. But what you're thinking about from a bind perspective is, who are those key successes in your organisation that we really need to focus on, either because they're at risk of leaving for some reason, or because they need a new experience or promotion to ultimately get them to be able to have the skill sets that you need. It might be that it's a skill set that you know is somewhat rare in the market and that your competitors are actively looking for. So you might want to think about what's going to tie an employee to your organisation. And these things can be really different according to the person. So I would first suggest never have just standard retention practices. You really need to understand the individual that you're trying to retain.
Definitely.
To think about some of your other talent strategies and how they might be applied to help bind a person. So when we start to talk about the strategy around boost, if your key successor is at risk and you know that they're very ambitious and wanting to move, then you might decide a boost strategy is really helpful. You might find that the successor that's really critical for you to retain has a really strong need for flexible work environment, and you might be able to fulfill that. You might find it's not about ambition, but it's around some different career experiences, and that you're in a unique position to be able to offer those experiences. And there is always the old remuneration benefits that you need to consider and make sure that they're being paid competitively. I will say, in general, my experience is money alone won't bind somebody to an organisation, and if it's the only thing that's binding them, then it's probably not a great position to be in.
It's probably going to only be for the short term anyhow.
Exactly right. So retention bonuses might be important if, for example, you're going through a really high risk project that you need to have that person on board for. We see it a lot when we're doing mergers and acquisitions, that we might say, okay, for a short term, we need this person to be bound to us, and we know that you know that monetary retention bonuses are going to be the thing that's going to keep them. So for short term, sure, but for longer term, you really need to be thinking about what's important to this person and how can we help fulfill that career need for them.
And I think that's really important also to be proactive about that. Don't let the employee actually already get to that disengagement before you actually sort of start having those conversations with them.
Yeah.
So really be proactive and be focused on their engagement to help bind them, because it might be too late if they're already starting to disengage.
Yeah, and I think also some organisations get really stuck in a lot of these different strategies around the cost of them. And what I find really powerful to think about is look at your return on investment potentially around some of these areas, because you know it's all well and good to get a little blasé around your talent in the organisation and go, well, you know, we can find another Joe tomorrow. But the fact of the matter is, it will often cost you considerably more to go and find somebody and bring them in. It's sometimes not until we're going and recruiting that we realise what a good deal we had.
That's right.
In the talent that we had. It can also be quite expensive in looking at whether you're borrowing talent in. So you need to understand that, and just the cost of having some of these critical roles vacant for a period of time. So I would always say, whilst I don't like to throw money at a problem, I also don't want to not do the right thing just because I'm concerned about some short-term cost implications.
Yes.
So getting clear about those return on investments is really important. Which brings us to one of the other strategies, and I'm going to give you another example in a minute that kind of works across a few of them. The boost is about where do we need to accelerate development? Are there areas in the business that we need to accelerate? Are there blockages that we need to remove to help build a person's career? So again, talking through that same organisation where we looked at we need we know we do better when we build talent from within, and we've got some key talent that we know, given a few experiences, will be able to thrive in a leadership role. We had to make some really interesting decisions around what are some of the ways we could boost them. One of the things that we used to look at was we wanted people who had cross-country experience, international experience. We wanted people who had different industry experience, and it was really valued in the organisation to have people with an MBA. From a global perspective, that really helped us move people up through their career paths. So one of the boost strategies we used in that particular scenario was we looked at an employee who we thought the breadth that they would get from completing an MBA would be really critical, and we also knew that given the way they operated, it would be very tough for them and for their family, frankly, for them to go through trying to juggle their work and completing an MBA. So we gave that person a 12-month sabbatical, fully paid, and we paid for them to complete their MBA in an accelerated way. And then we brought them back in, and we very quickly promoted them through to several rungs above where they had been. So there were some really powerful mechanisms that we were thinking about there. We were looking at boosting. We were looking at how to bind them. We could see that they will be sought after in the market. It gave us some opportunity while they were gone to make some other moves in the organisation that we needed to make sure that we had the right role available for them when they got back. So sometimes thinking really differently. I remember when we sat around the table and said, what if we did this? The first discussion was, that's going to be expensive. We're going to be looking at a big salary for an entire year if somebody is not going to be here for that time. And we're going to be looking at the cost of an MBA. That's huge. But when we started to do that return on investment, we quickly realised that if that created the talent we needed in the future, it would actually be worth far more to us than the cost that we were looking at expending. That's all about boosting. And then we look at bounce. This is a really interesting one, and this is the one where I spoke to you about the quote from our Netflix People and Culture founder. And bounce is all about thinking about where your pipeline might be blocked and how we'll address it, and also where is their non-performance. So I think this is sometimes where organisations do get a little stuck, and I've seen plenty of times where, one, you've been doing your succession planning, you've been thinking just about that next role, and you've been bringing people up who go, yes, they could do the, marketing director role or the sales director role. That's great. We bring them up into the next position. And I remember working with one of our clients, and I sat down and took him through his org structure and said, okay, explain to me all the talent that you have directly reporting into you. And every single one, the CEO was saying, yep, they're not going to be capable of moving to my role. This person's not going to be capable of moving to my role. And we realized that he had an entire leadership team that none of them were going to be his successor, and his role was to build a successor. So it was around sitting there and saying, one, we need to get better at thinking about when we're moving people through an organisation, if they don't have potential to ultimately make it to the CEO role or to the next role that's important, then we need to think about, are they the right person to put in that immediate role? And two, we also need to get better at thinking about when that pipeline is blocked, what can we do to unblock it? Now, that could be where a restructure is needed, where we actually have to think about capabilities for the future and the roles for the future, and conduct a restructure where you might find that there are redundancies. It could be that there's a performance gap, and that you actually have to have those tough discussions with an individual to say, the level that we need you to perform at is not at the level that you're at now. Or it could be planning for the longer term, knowing that if that person might, take a lateral move, etc., planning who you're going to bring up through that organisation. But really, it's sitting down and saying, if we have a blocker, what are the options that we have to unblock that role, and to get really clear about that.
And it might also be, as part of that bouncing, is that we had a particular client have an employee within a particular role, and they could see, I guess, that she was capable of providing that strategic perspective, but she was too busy doing the operational. So it's about, I guess, bouncing that operational day-to-day out and moving her up so she could focus on that strategy. So it's not necessarily a redundancy as such, but it's that combination of the bounce and the building of moving things out of people's roles to them to be capable to achieve what they need to.
Yeah. So I think, you know, as we go through the entirety of the 6 Bs, really what comes to mind for me is your role from a HR leadership perspective is to really get clear about the future direction of the organisation, and to make sure that everything that you do is grounded in that. And you know, often when we work with clients, our starting point will be, right, where's your strategy? Where's your business strategy? And then where's your people strategy? And we get well, we don't really have one. So the first thing is you need to get really clear on that. You cannot build an effective talent management plan to help your organisation to succeed in, you know, 2, 3 or more years if you're not really clear on what success looks like and how you're going to get there. So first is getting really clear on that. Second is getting really clear on where you are now and really understanding what is that gap for you as an organisation. And finally, it's around having some really open discussions and partnering discussions with your leaders to think about all of those different strategies. And I do find as soon as you start to just put a framework like this on the table, it opens up the discussion and helps you think about things differently. Definitely. You know, when you're just standing there looking at your org chart, looking at the people under it and trying to have a discussion about how to shift them, it's a pretty tough discussion. But when you start to think about a framework like this, where you think about where we're trying to get to, what are some of the critical gaps we're going to face, and then start to think about these 6 Bs and how you would apply them, I think it's a much more powerful discussion and really gets you to the right end point. So I did have some questions. Oh, okay. So what I'd have you think about is a few questions in terms of how do you identify your talent gaps now? Do you have any discussions internally around the 6 Bs or any other ways of thinking about your talent strategies? The 6 Bs are, you know, as I said, fairly well indoctrinated in the HR language, but to me, it's not about the acronyms you use, it's about the discussions that you have. And do you need to think about a more structured way to assess and strengthen your talent pipeline, and how are you going to approach that within your business? Hopefully we've given you some food for thought, and you take it back to your team or your partners that you support in your organisation and can have a really robust discussion around it. Any questions, please don't hesitate to contact any of us on the slide here. As I said, today it has been brought to you by myself, Janine Waters, and Callie Mitchell, but the whole team is really passionate about this subject and very happy to support you in your journey around improving your talent management. And then I would invite you to attend any of our previous webinars or sign up to see the future webinars that we have coming in the next coming months. Thank you again for your time. Just the final disclaimer, all care has gone into producing this, but I would encourage you to always do your own research and build a framework and an approach that's going to be right for your organisation. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope you have a great day and happy end of financial year.
Thanks, Janine.
Bye.